How's everyone doing? Getting settled?
Awesome.
All right, then.
Ready to start?
I think we can start.
All right, well, great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Donna Ford from Vanderbilt University, who has been with us all day today. And she's going to be talking about equity in our underrepresented student groups, and in particular, our Black, Latino, and low-income students. And so because we only have an hour together, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Ford, and we'll carry on here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to do an abbreviated overview of what was talked about earlier in the session, focusing on the very same topic that every student counts, seeking equity for underrepresented, what you call high cap students, and I might just say gifted throughout this presentation. And I want to hone in on three populations, and that will be Black students, Hispanic students, and any student who who comes from a low income background. So what I want to do is, again, it's going to be very abbreviated based on earlier. Just say a little bit about myself, focus on the achievement gap and underachievement, talk about underrepresentation, what factors contribute to that, what are the barriers for recruitment and retention. I want to present you with an equity formula that I hope the district will adopt in order to not just be equitable in terms of philosophy, but equitable in terms of being able to quantify it. And we won't have time to talk about models of culture, so I meant to take that out, excuse me. And then some recommendations for change. So I just a little bit about me. I am from Cleveland, Ohio. I grew up in a low-income family, and so therefore I have a strong compassion, empathy, and commitment to doing what's equitable for students who come from low-income backgrounds. I'm African American, unapologetically so, and so I have a very strong commitment to doing what's right and what's just for students of color, especially those who are disenfranchised in our schools. Grew up in a single-parent home, and I like to, put in educators' minds that even children who grew up in single-parent families can do well, can be identified as gifted, should be identified as gifted. My work is on closing and helping educators close the achievement gap, and in some areas it's a gulf or a canyon. You can use any term you want to, but those three groups of students are just not doing well, and we can and must do better. So my work is on those 5 areas, but for this short time that I'm here immediately is to focus on how can we desegregate gifted programs, advanced placement classes, as well as IP nationally and in this district. One of my main arguments, major arguments, is that in order to close the achievement gap and to address underachievement, we have to do a number of things, but at least 3. One is we have to address special education overrepresentation in the high incidence areas. We have to address overrepresentation among those 3 groups, specifically related to discipline. Obviously, I'm talking about suspension and expulsion. And then third, we have to address the underrepresentation issue in terms of gifted education, advanced placement, and IB. So I am arguing that lack of access to gifted programs contributes to 2 things: underachievement, as well as it flames, makes larger achievement gaps. So what we have when students, these 3 groups don't have access to gifted programs is a pipeline issue. You're not identified as gifted, then how are you going to get into AP and IB classes? And not just how will you get into college, but how will you get into some of the more elite colleges? So we've got to start early to make sure that we are giving access to gifted programs for low-income Black and Hispanic students. So I just mentioned earlier that I strongly believe, and I hope you agree, that underrepresentation in our advanced classes contributes to underachievement and the achievement gap. I also want you to know that it's not just my view. It is, there's a lot of data indicating, lots of studies indicating that is so. So when we look at a study by Barton and Coley, their second study called Parsing the Achievement Gap, where they examined 16 factors, 16 correlates of the achievement gap. Of all the 16 that are here, they consistently find, based on other studies using meta-analysis, that lack of rigor in the curriculum is the number one variable, the number one correlate that contributes to the achievement gap. Lack of rigor is about low expectations for those three groups of students. It's also about lack of access, and it's in the reports, in this report in particular, it's about lack of access to gifted programs, and again, that would and advanced placement classes. So the data are consistent that this is an issue. So much of what I talked about this morning, and want you to think about, comes from at least 3 of the books that I have written: Recruiting and Retaining Culturally Different Students in Gifted Programs, Multicultural Gifted Education, and Reversing Underachievement Among Gifted Black Students. Concepts that I want you to consider as you increase access and address underrepresentation would be desegregating our gifted and AP and IB classes. And desegregation is a quantity piece. It is, how do we get the numbers equitable? How do we address numbers? So recruitment. Once students are recruited, what's going to happen in their classroom? So that's more about integration. So how do we make sure that quality of life is good, is positive, once we identify and place the underrepresented students in our gifted, I'm just going to use the word advanced classes, in our advanced classes. I want to talk about equity, and I mentioned that already in the title, so I'll skip that. I want you to be thinking about opportunity to learn. In this district, you have a lot of high-income students, maybe only about 13% students who live in poverty. And so many of the high-income students come, many, not all, prepared and ready to learn. They are advantaged, they are privileged, they have a lot of social, cultural, economic, and political capital. That's not the same for many students who live in low-income situations. So they know how to advocate for their students, even, by the way, when their students should not be in gifted programs. They know how to persuade administration to allow their students to be identified. So the status quo has a lot of power, and that power and privilege, unearned privilege, that power doesn't trickle over to those who live in low income, come from low income backgrounds. So opportunity to learn. I've also talked to administration about about the notion of potential and talent development. We have a lot of low income students who are just brilliant, and many are very, very creative and very good problem solvers. But if you don't have programs in place and the mindset in place to see potential in students, then you're not going to refer them for gifted programs, and that's going to be problematic. So how do we take maybe that second layer of students, at least according to tests, who may not test well, and identify them as having potential, and work with them so that they eventually will meet the criteria. I want to argue that, in particular for Black and Hispanic students, if our educators and administrators are not culturally competent, therefore won't be culturally responsive, then we're going to have a difficult time having teachers see gifts and talents in children who come from backgrounds economically and racially that I come from. I also want to talk a little bit, especially when we get to equity, about the notion of disparate impact. It is possible to have policies and procedures in place that you did not think were discriminatory, and in the end, they really are. So you've had a disparate impact, and that has hindered access to our more advanced programs. I've talked to an administrator about defensibility and alignment, and that'll become clear in the next slide. But our student population, we need to look at who they are, and then think about our definition, then think about how we assess, the instruments as well as the criteria. And then the curriculum. That has to be aligned, it has to be in sync, otherwise we're not meeting the needs of even students who get formally identified as gifted. And then finally, related to that is the notion of assessment. I'm glad to see that this is a district that is not using one measure, one test to identify students, because you really don't learn anything about a student based on one measure. It's impossible to learn, to really know what the student's strengths and needs and challenges are based on one measure. So it's always important to look at state definitions, and I won't read the definition, I just want to highlight some points for you. But your state definition, again, you use the word highly capable students, and it talks about having superior intellectual ability. And then it talks about having creative ability and leadership, as well as excelling in academic areas. So I think that thus far, the district, based on what I've seen in a few conversations, you are identifying intellectually gifted students. You are identifying academically gifted students, but you are not identifying creatively gifted students, no less those in leadership. So there needs to be some significant changes, important changes in terms of alignment. I want to make it clear, and I know I'm talking fast and I'm thinking about an hour, but I want to make it clear that the rigor of the curriculum and the services and the programming will increase when you do more to serve students who are creatively gifted. Some people believe that the intellectually gifted is the prized type of gifted to be, followed by the academically gifted, and then just totally discount the creatively gifted. You're doing those students and this district a disservice, a grave disservice, by not focusing on the creatively gifted students. And we've talked about a little bit about ways to do that. So include that in your services. My focus, and this is to be repetitive a little bit, is on what are we going to do for recruitment. Screening, referral, assessment, identification, and eventual placement/services. But it's important to not stop there. It's critical to not stop there. You have to also consider, once students are identified, those underrepresented groups in particular are identified, what are we going to do to make sure that teachers have the mindset to not undermine that student's belief in him or herself as an academician? What are you going to do so that teachers do not say what I think is one of the most insulting, disgraceful, negative comments you can, and that is to change some of the criteria or to let Black, Hispanic, and low-income students in the gifted program, that you're watering it down. I don't think there should be a teacher in this district that should be allowed to teach who has that mentality, who has that mindset. You will undermine all that's been done with recruitment if you talk about watering down anything or those children, etc. It's a disgrace that any educator would say that. And of course, nobody said that to my face, but I'm saying I see it happen too often in gifted education. There's no place for that mindset. There's no place for that thinking in education at all. So my goal is to bridge two disciplines. And one is, you can call it culturally responsive education, or you might be familiar with multicultural education. What do we know about children of color? Who they are as cultural beings? What are their values, beliefs, attitudes, habits, customs, and traditions? When we understand who our culturally different students are, we will see gifts and talents and not make up deficits that just really are in your head. Then we need the training in gifted education, but it cannot be colorblind. So how can we merge what we know about children of color, culturally different populations, with what we know about gifted students, so that someone like me who is Black and gifted would not be done a disservice in this particular district, or any district. One of the things we did earlier was, I had a formal presentation, but I also like to open it up for a little bit of, discussion and commentary before I actually jump into your data. So does anybody, and I don't know who I should be looking at, have a question or a comment? I know I just ran through that. Don't ask me to repeat it. Don't ask me. Any questions or comments?
I have one quick question,
Yes.
the notion of community schools. So I got to go to the community schools forum that was in Albuquerque, and they talked a lot about the things, and like students who have a sore tooth aren't going to be able to learn, and the kind of the physiological things, and then the time, and then they also have like the homework diners, where the families and everyone comes in. What's the level of influence that has? Is it,
Yeah, thank you. So the mother and me, the grandmother and me, and just the counselor, I have a degree in counseling. I think about just one theory right now, and that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some people talk about wraparound services, those kinds of things. And then we talk about lack of high quality health care for some children, or no health care for some children. But I remember one time I was in an inner city school, an urban school, and it was a fourth grader who had been bouncing on her bed, and she fell off and chipped one of her front teeth. And she was usually a very sweet little girl. That day she was frowning. She wouldn't talk to anybody. She wouldn't open her mouth. She wouldn't even smile. It was also the day they were going to take the test. The one day they're going to take the test for gifted. So I went up to ask her, what is wrong? And she said, when the wind hits my tooth, because I guess a nerve was exposed, it hurts. So I asked the teachers, I said, well, can we go get her whatever the medicine is for teeth, to numb it? And they said, no, it's illegal. I'm saying, this little girl does not have health care. The nurse does not come for 3 days. She's got to suffer. I mean, she doesn't have dental care. She's got to suffer. And the answer is yes. How do you think she did on that test? On that one particular day? And there were no exceptions made. So, first of all, that's unempathetic. Where's the compassion? All right. What else could be done for the little girl? But if we have those type of services in school, we tackle Maslow, meeting those basic needs, even though they don't have them in home and school. So I'm 100%. I love when I go to schools and I see them filling cavities. Anybody ever had one? That hurts. All right. So, and more. So absolutely. Yeah. All right. So I examine data from the Office for Civil Rights. This is where I always go when I'm looking at data, ocrdata.ed.gov, and it's called their Civil Rights Data Collection. Yes, it's usually a couple of years behind because they're working with 100% of schools, and they've got to make sure it's accurate, clean it up, look at whether there are drastic changes from one year to another. But it has data on just about everything you can imagine. And so I just, pulled a few slides, and I wanted to present to you what I got off OCR's website, knowing that there's more recent data. So this is from 2013-14 school year, and this is what you submitted. And yes, I know that there are like 22,000 students now, but we're just going by this. And it talks about, it shows that at this time, white students were 63.5% of your district. However, there were only 43.7% of gifted programs. So for white students, there was underrepresentation. The next largest group in the district would be Asian students. They were like 13.9% of your district. They were 41.4% of gifted programs. That is huge, almost comparable to white students. And I said earlier, that's one of the times I've not seen that huge of an overrepresentation. I usually see it for white students, but it's one of the first times I've seen it that drastic for Asian students. I'm not going to go through all of those. I want to go next to Hispanic students. And as I'm doing this, this is like psychological. I want you to keep in mind, Hispanic students are very close in percentage in this chart to our Asian students. But look at their representation in gifted programs. There should be alarm bells going off. There should be people angry just looking at these data. There should be a concerted effort to say, we have got to do a better job with our Hispanic students. How can they only be 3.1% of gifted programs?
I think it's lower now too.
You think it's lower?
And it's high, there's 17%.
Okay.
17%.
So there's
Hispanics,
even
and it's lower
a larger
representation.
degree of underrepresentation, perhaps, as well as that means it's even more inequitable. Black students are 1.8% of the district at that time, 1.4% of gifted programs. So you're doing a lot better with black students, which is rare, than you are with your Asian students. Then you can look at discipline, and so the pie chart changes. You know, over there is where we start from representation, but then you look at Hispanic students becoming almost 20% of those for in-school suspension, and that little 1.8% of black students in the district made a huge leap in terms of in-school suspension. So you can find, as a district, kids to suspend, but you can't find any to identify as gifted if they're black or Hispanic. Look at, 8.9%. Look at out-of-school suspension, and then, you can look at expulsion. But what I want to say, for the most part, when we're talking about suspension, and I'll try to keep it brief, usually the suspensions with African Americans are mostly subjective reasons, not objective reasons. And so I'm keeping that really, really brief. The number one group suspended in the United States will be black males. Some people think the next group is white. I'm talking in terms of percentages. Some people think the next group will be white males. No, it's black females. Black females are suspended at a percentage rate higher than white males. And that's flipped in the last couple of years. And one book to read is called Push Out. I don't remember the rest of the subtitle, but Push Out. Okay, so we've got to look at, in particular, at subjectivity and the role that is playing. And the subjectivity, not just subjectivity, but cultural clashes as well. Like a teacher might say something like, when I'm talking to you, look me in the eye. Well, what if that's not their culture? What if the culture is, if I look you in the eye, that's disrespectful? And that's just one example. And then what if it's a large black male and he does look you in the eye and stand a little close to you? Then teacher's like, well, he was intimidating to me and he was threatening to me. You said look me in the eye, I did. And then my culture has a short, small proximity. Now we're getting into something that's culturally assaultive, at least on two levels. So we've got to get that training to be culturally competent. And then the last two, at least in terms of data, would be, or your data, would be looking at advanced placement. And so, just look at the color of the bar charts. The only place that in particular black students seem to have access to AP, at maybe an equitable level would be in science. And then you look at Hispanic students, and nowhere is there equity in advanced placement classes. So I want to bring you back to the notion of pipeline, particularly if you're not in gifted programs, how are you going to get access to these AP programs? Data indicate from the College Board that the number one barrier to accessing gifted and to accessing AP is teacher recommendations, or more specifically, lack thereof. A second barrier is could be, and in this district I think it's the case, relying on families to nominate their children, and those in the higher income bracket will aggressively do so. We have similar problems with IB. All right, so any questions about those slides before we quantify equity?
So I have just a question. We don't require a nomination. Anybody that wants to participate in AP or IB is allowed to. Now, I'm not dismissing that we've got a pipeline issue, but it's not about parents nominating or teachers nominating. How?
For overall, for gifted, or
for the IB, AP programs, anybody that wants to take them can take them. But it sounds like we've got a different issue other than a nomination issue as to why our kids are underrepresented in those.
Okay, so if teachers are not, if you're not getting input from teachers, you have to definitely study and see what those barriers are. And, you know, even if it's like self-nomination, students can nominate themselves, you have to have experience challenged to want to continue to get challenged. You have to have had messages that you're going to do okay in AP and IB classes for you even to sign up. So those who've already been gifted, oh, no problem, I'll just continue on this pathway. Those who haven't. So self-selection would also be a problem. Or maybe students don't even know about AP or IB. So how are they going to nominate themselves? And I think there can also be subtle messages, whether not necessarily what's written, but the hidden curriculum, those hidden messages that can communicate to students like me, from my background, that you're not even, don't even think about AP. And if it's a male, don't think about AP, just go and get that football. So we have, so your district, and most districts now are using the word, we are an equitable district. We want to be equitable. And so I love that in philosophy. Equality is not working. Students coming to us with different needs need something different. So we need to talk about equity. What do we do that's fair? And in this process of fairness, it's not saying take anything away from those who are already privileged, but let's give more to those who don't have some of the resources and things like that. So even though I like this picture, I would put like a little box under that one right there. I don't have my little laser because it's like he's getting nothing, right? But give him something. All right. And then just one other picture. So here is equality. And yes, I'm mindful of Brown versus Board of Education. Children need an equal opportunity to learn. That's not worked. It's just not. We need an equitable opportunity to learn. That will be the second. And the thing is, there will always be barriers. And then one example that I use, at least in the context of gifted, is that we're going to always have tests. I don't see anybody in this room going to get rid of tests, or in this nation going to get rid of tests. But can we use tests that are more fair and responsive to those who tend not to do well on tests? There are tests out there that we can use. There are policies and procedures. We're always going to have policies and procedures, but can we make changes? So I think this is the image that I want you to keep in mind. So we have just 2 slides on equity, but now let's quantify it. So I want you to consider these equity ranges. These are not I've used these in several districts, as well as in a court case that I'll put up in a minute. I want you to think about disparate impact. You can read a court case called Griggs versus Duke Power, or have your attorneys summarize that court case for you from early 1970s. You can get on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's website, EEOC, and you will see this formula applied to careers, to employment opportunities. And then the term that you will also see on EEOC's website and in some other court cases is what's called the 80% rule, and that's the one I want to apply. You can read about how the state of Missouri has adopted this formula at the state level. The Department of Education, has adopted this formula at the state level, where they're saying that every district in the state will apply the equity formula that I'm going to share. You can read about the equity formula in District Q46 court case, which is in Elgin, Illinois. And you can read about it in a court case in Tucson. So I'm only aware of 2 court cases, but it's been used in a lot of districts. So here is how the formula works. And we're primarily looking at the bottom one, although I'm going to use some verbiage up from the top. So if black students in the United States, using OCR data from 2016, represent 19% of schools. However, we're only 10% of gifted programs. Now, I like what Dr. Reid did earlier, and that's like at the district level. Let's quantify that. Like, how many students are we really talking about? Well, at the national level, we're talking about 253,000 black students who've not been identified as gifted, using that discrepancy. 253,000. So let's start with the 19. And so then you say 19, and we're using the 80% rule. 19 times 0.8 is 15.2. As a nation, to be equitable, black students or any group that is 19% of a district must be a minimum of 15.2% of gifted programs. So it's the 80% rule with the 20% allowance is what I call it, and others have called it. So that means as a nation, we need to go from 10% of those identified as gifted to 15.2% of those identified as gifted. And I want to emphasize that would be your minimum percentage starting when you start at 19. When it's, say, special education, discipline, dropping out, something that's more something that's considered negative or not favorable, then you would take that 19% and multiply it times 1.2, and that would give you your maximum representation. So if you exceed that maximum, you're inequitable with that population. Say, if we're going to use this example in special education. If you go back to this one, if you don't meet that minimum, you're inequitable in gifted education, advanced placement, IB. So those are two quick overviews of the formula. Questions?
So essentially, it's 20% on either side of.
20%, so that's where you get that range, it's 20%.
That makes sense.
So, you might say, well, what's the allowance for? This is about fairness. Low-income students are to come with less of a language-rich or literacy-rich environment, so not likely to test well, not likely to have that high vocabulary that people look at as one characteristic of gifted. We're more likely to go to substandard schools. We're more likely to not have access to preschool, or if it is access to preschool, it's more of a daycare. They're babysitting, they feed your baby and put the baby to bed. They're not doing anything academic. And, more, but it's usually those injustices that keep us from, performing to the level that we really could perform. So you get an allowance. If you exceed that allowance, and this is going to be a bold statement, if you exceed that allowance, then in districts where I worked, in the court case where I worked, at the state levels where I've worked, we would say that racism is operating. And that's a word that's tough for some people to swallow, but this is beyond statistical chance. This is human error at work when you are outside that equity band. So if we're talking about, black and Hispanic, then we're talking about race. If we're talking about economics, low-income students, then we're talking about classism is at work. And by the way, I can't recall what your numbers are for females, but when I observed a couple of schools a day, it was hard to find some females in some of these gifted classes, these at the elementary and middle level. So I think there might be a little sexism operating. We got to examine those data, which is odd, especially when most teachers tend to be female, and yet our females are not in these STEM classes throughout the nation, no less what little bit that I observed in a couple of schools. So minimum is 80%, maximum is 1.2. So I calculated, so I want to put two things out here and then open it up again for questions, or I just let you jump in. But this is the more recent data from your district. I think it was 2016-17, and this was about low-income students. So on average, the district is identifying 7.8% of students as gifted. All your 22,000 students, you're identifying 7.8%. Then your district is 13.63% low income, which is over here in the red. All right, so about almost 14% of your district is low income. Of all students identified as gifted, you are only identifying 4.26%. So two things. One, severe underrepresentation. Two, it's inequitable for your low-income students. You're doing a disservice to students who live in poverty at that rate. If we apply that 80% minimum, that means that your gifted program should be comprised of 10.9% of children who live in, come from low-income backgrounds. You've got to more than double the percent/number of low-income students for your high cap program. If students, thinking about Maslow, if students are coming to us without a lot of resources, and then they come to school and they're not getting the support they need in terms of the challenge, what are these students doing? Did you say that you thought it was about 200 students more than need to be
In the
identified?
Latino, when we did the Latino numbers.
It's about
it was
200.
just
Oh,
about-
that was Latino. Sorry, let me not jump ahead. All right, so you need to quantify, what that means in terms of how many more students need to be identified. Every student counts. At the national level, it's a lot of students, but we're not talking about national. We're talking about yours. What are your children, your students who live in poverty, doing? So this looks to be a district that is only interested in serving its high-income populations. And high income, by default, means which racial group?
Right.
White.
Asian.
And Asian.
And Asian.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Again, I got to get used to that huge discrepancy. So I'm still stunned by what I saw. So let's replace it. Let me rephrase that. This looks like a district that is mainly interested in identifying Asian students than white students, but definitely high income students. And by the way, of those 4.2% that you have identified, I really would like to know their race and what their gender is as well.
And what I find interesting is I was going to bring this up to Michelle the other day, is I went into, my daughter's going to Leota Middle School, and I went into a high cap class, and I didn't get the opportunity to say this to you, but I was surprised as to how there wasn't diversity, and even what I felt in that one particular class, underrepresentation of white, which you don't normally see. And I remember kind of being, I'm not saying that's the whole program at Leota, but was that one class, and I was very surprised by that. Mm-hmm. And so I hadn't shared that with you yet, and I was like, we need diversity all around. And I've been a big advocate of the Hispanic and low income, but I noticed it was overrepresented.
So hold on. Let's jump just to one slide, and then let me go to what you just said. So in this slide here, I just went and calculated the range for you, 20 on this side, 20 on that side. So for Asians to be 13.9% of the district, they should be a minimum of 11. I'm just going to forget the little parts after the decimal, but a minimum of 11% and a maximum of almost 17. Max. And you're at what? 41? Look at black students. We should be in the range of, so you're close with black students. Very, very close. I would say pretty equitable. Again, I would want to know, are those only the high-income black students, though? Or are they mainly females rather than males? It's not just the number. I want to know gender and I want to know income. Look at your Hispanic students. They should be a minimum of 9, almost 10%, and a maximum of almost 15%. Again, I'm rounding up. And then white students should be a minimum of about 51% and a maximum of 72%. You could also calculate biracial. You're doing a pretty good job. So, just do that 7.5 times the 0.8 and then times the 1.2 to get your range. So when I was looking at some of the information sent to me and the 4 schools that I looked at, what I want to say is that you have clearly racially identifiable programs. And to be blunt, all you have to do is walk down the hall, look at the demographics, and you're like, okay, that's a general ed classroom, that's a gifted ed classroom, that's a cluster classroom. It was so predictable.
Yeah.
All right, so
Especially at Leota.
this means diving into the data, and obviously I'm not going over all of these, but and the X means that's one of the schools that I looked at, but I just want to stick with Hispanic for right now. So, and I didn't plan which ones I would look at. So, let's look at Canyon Creek and look at Hispanics. 11%, but only 4% identified as gifted. And then let's look at College Lake. Almost 13% of that student population is Hispanic. You can find one not even 1%, which is still egregious, none identified as gifted. That is statistically impossible. Look at Crystal Springs Elementary, almost 19%, 113 students, and you couldn't find any, but there are 181 Asians, and you could find 70% of those. So just a state-by-state look, racially identifiable gifted programs and many classes, and this is potentially illegal. If I were a judge, I would say it's illegal.
Civil rights issue.
A civil rights issue. What are those kids doing? So the data are, and there's 4 more charts here, but I'm saying we don't have to go through all of those.
Can you go back to Leota really quick? I just want to
Which
see if
one?
what I, go one back. I just want to see if what I was seeing with my eyes. Yeah, it was primarily Asian. That's what I was noticing. And how much is white there? Oh, there's about equal.
So I'm like the percentages, but then when you see the actual numbers, it's just very, 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 very telling. So there has to be a major paradigm shift, policies and procedures in order to, in particular, tackle Hispanic students.
Look at Kenmore, you guys. This is, this conversation is something that I've been so passionate about, and just to be able to see the numbers finally and look at that there's almost 20% at Kenmore that we have Hispanic and zero. This is what I've been talking about, begging us to look at.
So what one of the things this means is even with your high income students who are Hispanic, what are you doing? You're not identifying them. So all those excuses about their low income, you can strip that away, take that away when it comes to your Hispanic students. You're not even identifying kids who have the same, perhaps, similar profiles as your white students. All right, so with this said, and keeping things in this perspective in mind, and it's abbreviated, I'm hoping that you will do a formal evaluation of your gifted program. And really disaggregate the data about the different programs, the grade levels, whether we're talking about a center school or cluster modeling. There's another kind of program. It's called not choice. Anyway, there was another challenge. All right. You've got to look at policies and procedures. You got to look at the impact of referral and or checklists. You got to look at which tests should be used and seek to be equitable for not just this 87% or 86% of your higher income population, but also that 13, almost 14% of those who are low income. And you have to do the same by race. We didn't do it by race and gender, black males, Hispanic females, those kinds of things. But it would be telling if you were to do that. So the bottom line is this district is not equitable. And you could talk about it in philosophy all you want. The numbers say just the opposite. The students who are the most disadvantaged by race/ethnicity are your Hispanic students, but believe me, don't discount black just because we're just 1.8%. We matter as well. And you've got to do a better job with low income students who live in low income backgrounds. So I want to put I've talked to the superintendent, assistant superintendent, Jen, and a few others about some things that could be done along poverty lines. Even though I gave you all the equity minimum for students who live in low income populations, you don't have to use that equity. You can specifically say low income students are almost 14% of our district, and we're going to be almost 14%. They're going to be almost 14% of those identified as gifted. You don't have to use that equity formula. You can change the test, you can change the criteria, you can change the IQ score, and you should. There are reasons children who live in low income backgrounds don't get the same IQ test IQ scores those who live in high income, but it is not because we're genetically inferior. Absolutely not. And I am not an exception. All right, not an exception. Last, I want to say that, and this is not from a formal evaluation, this is just looking at things. I like that the district has universal screening. That helps to temper the gatekeepers, which are educators.
So this will be the first year,
This
right?
Yeah. That helps to temper that. And when I say gatekeepers, this is what I'm talking about. Of every study that's been done that I could look at before 2009, there were about 22 studies. Under referral, black students was at 100%. In 50% of the studies that I found under referral, in half of the studies it was under referral for Hispanic students. And then white students are always referred. I've not really seen any data on Hispanic students. Asian students and Indian students. I want you to read Grissom and Redding's at least 2016 study. And it says, even when, and this is what I'm saying I think is happening in your district, even when black students meet the same profile as whites, and in this case it's probably Asians, your teachers or you all still are not referring them. That's discrimination. That's racial prejudice at work. That's a lot of things that you don't want to hear. But there is no question that racial discrimination has to be at work when you look at your numbers. So we got to make sure that teachers are well trained so that they will be, can open doors rather than close doors. So what I mean is deficit thinking is at work. The less our teachers know about children who live in poverty, the more they make up. The less they know about Hispanic students, black students, the more we making up. They make up. That training is critical. So going back to a previous slide, and my last slide, just for the sake of time, I like that the district is talking about a universal screener. It is very important that you're using several tests because that means you're doing assessment. I like that the district is focusing on Cogan subscale and saying that you can be high on one or the other for Cogan. By the way, you should add or nonverbal in that column.
Yeah.
And then I like that you have a multidisciplinary team. But I also want you to think about, and I don't know anybody's background, so just most teams are going, and I don't know your racial background, ethnic background, but just think about sitting at the table and I'm a student you're evaluating and nobody over here looking like me. That's a problem, especially if you don't have the training. I don't even have a chance, even if I met the criteria. All right, formally met the criteria, so go back to those studies.
Can I ask you a question about one of the tests we use, the ITBS, which is an achievement test?
That's an achievement.
And I know that you can test prep to that too.
And Cogan.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you suggest as a addition or as a replacement?
For me, when I look at achievement tests are less loaded with controversy. Like when people think about intelligence tests, they think genetic endowment. When people think about achievement tests, it's like, oh, they've learned that. So if they don't do well, maybe they didn't learn it. So that word alignment from a previous slide has to be in place. Does the ITBS align with your curriculum? And the reverse, does the curriculum align with the ITBS? If not, then those who have the extra support, in particular outside of school, they're gonna do better on the ITBS. So maybe I don't know, why did the district choose that test? Should it be another achievement test that is better aligned? But yes, you can prepare children to take achievement tests, prep them. I want to say the same with the traditional intelligence tests. So the COGAT, the WISC, Kaufman ABC, and others, whether they be individual tests or group tests, you can still prep. And it's been my experience in 25 years in the field that the most privileged parents, again, high income first and foremost, whites, and I guess in this district, Asian and Indian, are likely to find a way to get a hold of that COGAT, to get a hold of that ITBS, or to find older versions to prep their children. Or if you were doing individual tests, to go to the right psychologist to get that score. It's going to get your child into at least the screening pool, if nothing else. So test preparation is prevalent, but you don't see that among children who live in low-income situations, no less Black and Hispanic. So that just takes you to another, what do you want to do to evaluate family or parental referrals when you already know who's going to refer?
So, and we know anecdotally that test prep does happen. I mean, is there a way to guard against it in any way?
So, I'm gonna come to it when I get to the bottom one.
Okay.
So, I'm glad you have a multidisciplinary team, but that team must have representation from, a person of color or people of color. Two, then there needs to be alignment. In the definition is creativity, and so you need to be assessing for creativity as well as the curriculum.
And
needs to-
leadership, it said.
And leadership, and a curriculum. Leadership is somewhat a tricky one. It's hard to. I mean, there is an instrument out there. Can't think of the person's name right now. There's probably a couple out there now. But most people don't do anything with it. But why not? It certainly wouldn't hurt. We got children who are using their charisma and social skills and in socially unacceptable, ways. So I'd like to see that channeled, very much so, leadership. And it shouldn't just be, Kimberly is ran for head of the Honor Society, and so she's a leader. It's got to be developed as well. Referral by teachers and parents. Well, I just mentioned that a minute ago. But you got to keep that in consideration. I didn't say this strongly enough. I've been insinuating it, but I've been rushing, so sometimes I forget what I want to say. The number one reason, well, maybe I did, but the number one reason Black and Hispanic and low-income students are underrepresented in gifted education is teacher under referral. Then we can talk about the test and the policy and procedures. That is, and when I say referral, I'm just talking about input period. Number one reason. So that's got to be examined through an equity lens. We've got to look at when students are tested, what month, what day, and in this district, it only seems like thus far it's been on a Saturday, and I think early on, too early. And too early means it disadvantages students who, for summer loss, right, and didn't have those opportunities again. So it needs to be toward the end of the school. What, there's no time there because I'm already done. That's telling me to shut up, and I'm there. And then, and then I do believe that you should nurture gifts and talents as early as possible. And so I talked about talent development earlier. I like that you're looking at kindergarten, but are you really measuring, and it was said by someone else, nurture or nature? And I'm going to go with nurture. Let me make sure I got that right. Just has so much, and that just pushes you ahead. COGAT, again, I'm troubled that nonverbal needs to be used, and especially with ELL learners, and students who live in poverty. Last 2 points. I'm done. Last 2 points. Then you asked the question about what test is more fair, might help level the playing field, or less is equitable. And they tend to be nonverbal measures. And that my favorite one is the Naglieri Nonverbal Abilities Test, NNAT. I didn't mention this earlier, Superintendent, but I want to say it now. The nonverbal measures, in particular the Naglieri, it helps to identify Hispanic students, ELL learners, Black students, low-income students, and gifted underachievers. Those who are intellectually capable but may not have the academic skills. And you will be doing a disservice to you got the high IQ, but you're making C's. You're not gifted. Says who? Your imagination. That's a problem. So you got to work with your gifted underachievers as well, and many of them will be the 3 students we're talking about. And that's why I did my dissertation in my first book on gifted black students who underachieve. I just couldn't believe there was such a thing, but I learned that with my second grade son, black male. And then last, and this is one that I cannot emphasize enough, bothers me tremendously. Your screening percentile is not a screener. When you screen, you try to get as many students in the screening pool as possible and keep doing the assessments to narrow it to the, 7.8%? I think that's what you're identifying, or 10%, whatever that percent is. So your screener should be saying, we're gonna do further assessments on those who score at the 80th percentile, or you might even go 75th percentile. You have to decide that. But if it's more than 80th, that's not a screener. So you already identified the kids as gifted at the 96th percentile, and then make them go through all the hurdles to be at the 99th percentile.
Yeah.
Your screening percentile is not a screener. You do an identification, and then you do an identification again.
Which is part of why perhaps we haven't picked up as many Hispanic students.
Yeah, so a nonverbal measure will pick
Or
up
low income,
ELL
yeah.
learners. And by the way, even when I look at your Hispanic students, I don't know how many percent are English speakers already or are ELL learners, but guess what, you're not doing anything with either one. Whether they speak English or not, you're not identifying them. So you can't say, oh, they're English language learners, we can't find them. When they are, you're not finding them. So our black students who are low income have a double whammy. Our Hispanic students who are low income have a double whammy. This is an injustice along racial lines as well as across economic lines. And you're not serving all students. You're catering to a select demographic profile and economic profile.
Do you want to share briefly the IQ points? You made that
Oh,
point in
yes.
cabinet this morning. I just think
Yeah.
because we're on live stream, it's just important for people to understand that we're not talking about lowering standards. What we're talking about is gathering more students into program.
So on traditional tests, and there's a large number of tests that fall into there. So the Cogan, the WISC, the Binet, Kaufman ABC, traditional tests, and they usually have the verbal and the nonverbal subscale. On those measures, let's just start with income first though. Students who live in poverty, who are considered low income, get on average an IQ score of 85. Okay, so the mean IQ, so think of a bell curve. The mean IQ score of the US population is 100. And then 115, which is a standard deviation, is above average. And then people consider 2 standard deviations or an IQ of 130 gifted, and you can keep going up. And then if you go this way and take away the 15 points, that's considered below average. And if you take away a few more points, that's considered an intellectual disability. All right. So low income populations, on average, usually get an IQ of 85. And then if a district says, well, you need to get an IQ of 130 to be in a gifted program, we got to be what? 1, 2, 3 standard deviations, which is 45 points. Among students who are low income, it is my professional and personal belief that if you are low income, an IQ of 115, let me back up, I'm getting tired. If you are low income, an IQ of 115, which is 2 standard deviations above your mean, is an indication that you should be assessed further, that you could possibly be gifted. When it comes to higher income populations, the mean IQ is around 113. So when you say to be gifted, among high income populations, gifted to me is like about what? Add those 30 points. That's 145. I am not surprised when I see higher income populations getting an IQ of 130. To be in gifted programs. And then on the Naglieri instrument, the NNAT, white students get an average IQ of like 99.8, close to 100. So it's the same as they get on traditional tests, right? 100 and 100. Black students an average IQ of something like 97.8, and Hispanic students get an IQ of like 98.2. So, yeah. So we are just a few points, not even a half standard deviation. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. On the traditional test, where we just did income, blacks get an average of about 85. Hispanics get an average of about 85. So it's the same thing. When you see a black student get a 115, that student should be, that's 2 standard deviations above their average IQ, and the same would be for Hispanic students. So those 3 groups tend to get that 85. And I look at them as highly gifted if they get that 130. Gifted at 115. But on a nonverbal in particular in that, we're not talking about huge standard deviations. We're talking about just a few points. Why? The nonverbal measures reduce cultural loading. And we're talking about middle class culture with the items. You know, answers that a middle class person will be familiar with. And then they reduce the linguistic demand, that high reliance on language, which disadvantages ELL learners as well as students who come from low income backgrounds, and many African Americans who may not speak mainstream English, but speak Black English. That's going to have an effect on their test scores as well. But few speech language pathologists are looking at interventions with Black English speakers the way we do with ELL learners. What accommodations are being made for me as a native Black English speaker who, doing presentations, tries to remember mainstream and have to write it mainstream. But when this meeting is over, I'll be speaking Black English to my son, my mom, whomever, because I'm, I just go back to how I naturally talk, and I'm more comfortable talking.
So thank you, Dr. Ford. I think if we have about 10 minutes for the board. If you have any questions or comments or wonders for Dr. Ford, we can take those. We go on the dais at 7.
Right.
So I have a question in terms of transitions, and in terms of your work, districts who've made movements to close the gaps, to raise awareness. What are some of the kinds of strategies that have been effective at a district level, whether it's building level interventions, kind of executive level, individual? What kind of works to make the change in the achievement gap?
The changes in the achievement gap, special ed, discipline, gifted, AP, IB, has come from the top down. I mean, leadership has to believe it needs to happen and has to take steps to say this is what's going to happen so that we can truly be an equitable district. And so, yes, that means a lot of professional development training with everyone, not just teachers, but the school counselors, the speech and hearing department, not just the content area teachers, but what people call the specialists. I've been in districts where they invite to some professional development meetings the cafeteria staff. I mean, just anybody who touches, the front office staff who comes into contact with students, no less their families. The first image of what North Shore looks like, or your particular building is like, how you treat it when you go to that front desk.
We sometimes talk about or refer about our teachers on 6 wheels.
Teachers on 6 wheels.
Bus drivers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, teachers on
Bus drivers.
Yes. And I know there's a shortage, at least in Nashville, of bus drivers. But I think if they got that training and more, it would help as well. So it has to start there. But then it has to be a lot of public relations to get the more privileged parents to buy. And I'm not saying any particular order, because I just said then, but it has to be public relations and conversations, meetings, formal meetings with families about why we're doing this. It has to be outreach to the underrepresented parents so that they can be more advocates, better advocates, or just, know how to advocate for their children. I run a summer program, and it's in several schools along with Gilman Whiting. It's called the Scholar Identity Institute. And for 2 weeks, we will bring, and thus far it's been mainly black males, we're bringing black males on college campuses. And it could be for 1 week, but ideally it'd be 2 weeks. And we spend those 2 weeks promoting a scholar identity in those students. And there's 9 constructs that we specifically hone in on in order to do that. And on my website, for those of you who've been there, there's actually the longer video is 13-minute video on the scholar identity model. So what I'm saying is, with that model, what we're talking about is how do we take 2 weeks and unbrainwash our black males and Hispanic males to let them believe that they can be academicians, and then that would help them to even want to take advantage of gifted programs and advanced placement classes. And then we, once a month, have, say, some mentors come out and, get the young men in a group and give them their booster shots of scholar identity. So for 2 weeks, and then throughout the year. And we've got we're in a number of different schools and have had lots of funding to make this happen. But how do we get our students to talk about making sacrifices to be successful, taking more responsibility for why they did well, didn't do well, raise pride, academic self-confidence. So that's the model. But we've got since 2006, just years of data and curriculum. And so even training parents, which we've done in where is it over there somewhere, in the scholar identity model, so they could talk to their children like they're scholars, working with teachers. So a scholar identity philosophy is there. Really study, so that's that, but really also really studying the tests and looking at local norms. How are different groups scoring, across racial lines and economic lines on the sub-tests of the Cogan, not just the Cogan. And then how do they perform on the Naglieri? Also doing it across economics. So data collecting. And I think when you collect that data, then I think it'll give you an idea where to place the, priorities at the, like at the elementary level and, other kinds of things. So I was just rambling. I didn't write down what I said.
I think, Dr. Ford, if you could also mention the part this morning you talked about the lower income and the connection to creativity.
Yes, so there are 5 areas of giftedness. So there are 5 areas of giftedness: intellectual. Where did my mouse go? Let me just go by memory. 5 areas of giftedness. There's intellectual, which is IQ. Here it is. There's specific academic, and that is, in one or more of the subject areas. There's the leadership, which you mentioned, and well as visual performing arts. But in the middle is creativity, and it's there intentionally. Also, if you study Bloom's taxonomy, it was revised from 1985, and it was revised in 2004, where evaluation used to be the highest, which is IQ, which used to be the highest level of critical thinking. Now it's creativity, as of 2004, is the highest level of creativity. Evaluation moved under that. But creativity is in the center of this diagram for one specific reason, and it is that is a quote by Sternberg, and then I'll mention the poverty, and I'm being mindful of time. There's a quote by Sternberg who said, if you give an intellectually gifted child a problem, they would solve it. Creatively gifted individuals find problems to be solved. So when I updated my iOS system last night to 11, all I kept thinking was, thank you, creatively gifted person. I was not thinking about intellect. All right, and that iPhone 10X, which I can't wait for, yeah, I'm gonna pay that $1,000. Creatively gifted individual, not necessarily intellectually. They find problems to be solved. So the data indicate from lots of people, but I'm saying the father of creativity is E. Paul Torrance, and he talks about the positive, I misspoke on the name of it, but it's called the positive creatives of disadvantaged children. He meant, low income and economically disadvantaged, so the creative positives. Hundreds of studies, and he said that he and others have found that the most creative individuals are those who come from low income backgrounds. So for you as a district not to identify creatively gifted, you're doing a further disservice to students who come from low income backgrounds. We tend to be more flexible with our thinking, more resourceful, and think outside the box. And I'll just give you, just for fun, let's lighten it up a little bit. Creative. As a teacher, I think you'd appreciate that. I just see a dishwasher bin or whatever. I saw a colleague gave me this. So this is like one of the items you might see on the Torrance test of creative thinking. I mean, we're looking at L, and this person making a peacock. What would y'all have done? I don't know.
Written a word.
Written a word. I would have written a word. Yeah, I mean, this child making a peacock. And then, I didn't see that at my hotel, but first of all, that serves me no purpose. Tonight I ain't thinking about what little animal that is. I just go to bed. Now this one, you like this one?
I wouldn't want to eat off of that.
Somebody else's garbage is another person's what? Treasure, literally. And yes, we hope it's new, but woo, never been used. Creative. You make a way out of no way. You don't have the money. What about this one?
Right?
Creative. Just a few more. Somebody, would you get that up? Make a little basketball hoop. I bought my grandson KJ one. That thing cost me like $295. I could have just did this. Definitely you see this on some courts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to play this video, but you could probably, if it starts, I'm going to skip it. But this is a young man who made a bike and a lawnmower and got his own little company. And so he talks about it. He got his little business card. I'm not going to play this one, but here's a math one. You have to spend a lot of money. All right. And then I think the last one that I really want to, I'm not going to show it, but I like, is this went viral not too long ago. Well, I don't remember when it was, but I found it not too long ago. And he has a job interview, and he doesn't have an iron. So he takes a pot, boils hot water, and he's ironing his clothes. And others. So creativity is fluency, flexibility, elaboration, and or originality. And originality. And those are the four that would get measured on a Torrance test. So it is worth repeating. The children most hurt by you not having creativity. Now all kids need it. I want to make that clear. Are the children who live in poverty. Atrophy, you don't use it, you lose it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ford. Does anyone have any questions?
I could just listen to you for the next 8 hours.
So
You're like music.
Thank you.
I know we've been talking about Achievement Gap for years, and it's nice to have some concrete things to work with in order to make progress against it. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm pleased to see that leadership is concerned, committed. Goes back to something you asked earlier. I don't see that enough. Too much fear of the status quo rather than doing what's best for children.
And I
Of all
appreciate
walks
you
of
calling
life.
it out. I mean, it needs to be called out.
Yeah, I mean, you got a private school in those programs. Little country club.
Yep. So I thank you for, what I found interesting, you guys, is seeing the numbers of gifted per school.
Yeah.
And broken up by the demographics, because we see the total. I always feel that we should have representation in our gifted program that represents our demographics in the district. That's how I always think of it. The percentage of Hispanic should be his percentage in our gifted program. But to see it by school, which isn't something that I've thought of looking at, was like a knife in my heart.
I saw the tears.
Yeah, and
Coming. Yeah.
All right then. Well,
Thank
thank you.
you.
We'll formally
Thank you.
adjourn. So,
Huge.
thank you, Shane.
We have a creative lead.